The fabled phenomenon known as the Underground Railroad emerged in the early 1800s to help relay runaway slaves to freedom. Of the 4 million black people held in Southern slavery, perhaps 100,000 made it to freedom, perhaps only half that number. Various Underground Railroad routes led them to Mexico, to Spanish Florida, to the anonymity of American cities. The most famous destination, though, was Canada, the North Star, where slavery was outlawed. It's important to realize that most fugitives made their way on their own without help, and scholars today believe most who were helped by fellow blacks, not white sympathizers. But in some localities there was a network that relied on white help, and Waverly and Greater Abington was one such place. Old accounts of the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania describe fugitives moving through the perilous southern strip of the state, an area so infested with slave catchers it was called a, quote, hunting ground of the South, end quote. The runaways pressed northward, sometimes home by home or community by community. Moving at night, they would flare along ridge lines, river banks, and railroad lines. One confirmed route was along the Susquehanna River, up to Wilkes-Barre, and then to Factoryville, Montrose, and into New York State. Or they could hook over to Waverly, and from there to Great Bend and into New York. The map you see here traces the local routes along 2 old turnpikes. And beginning in the 1840s, some fugitives decided to stay in all-white Waverly and build new lives there. Why Waverly? It was a bit off the beaten path, which helped. The village was dominated by Democrats, the party that despised abolitionism. But Waverly also had a core of pious anti-slavery activists. The main person was Leonard Batchelor, who was part of a Presbyterian network, linking him to Wilkes-Barre to the south and Montrose to the north. Also, Waverly had Methodists and Baptists who were willing to buck the tide by getting intimately involved. The Methodists welcomed 2 early black fugitives into their congregation, and they and the Baptists joined in providing classroom education in the village schoolhouse, shown here. Esther Sisson, the daughter of one of the abolitionists, persuaded her husband to provide plots of land to the black settlers. Even village Democrats, including Andrew Bedford, a party leader who had fought to deprive blacks of the vote, went along to one degree or another. Villagers hired the fugitive men to tend the farms and the women to do domestic chores. They took the children into their schoolhouses without a fuss. And they effectively set up a zone of protection that was remarkable for its time. Thus, the settlement known as Colored Hill took root on the edge of town. Danger returned in 1850 with passage of the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. This law, which the South had won as a compromise over slavery's expansion, cracked down on the Underground Railroad by requiring that Northern whites help in catching fugitive slaves or face large fines and even jail time. Even many otherwise indifferent Northerners were bothered by the law's long reach into their very homes. The new law prompted white abolitionists in and around Waverly, who called themselves, quote, the Sons of Freedom, end quote, to write an emergency letter to allies in Montrose, where the letter still exists today in the County Historical Society. Here it is. The Waverly group said their, quote, colored friends, end quote, had begun carrying loaded pistols to protect themselves, and they called for a convention to protest the new fugitive slave law. The meeting was held in Montrose, and while the white allies denounced this new, quote, war on the colored man, end quote, they also signaled that they would not take up armed resistance themselves. That was left to the black people themselves. There was a line drawn elsewhere as well. There are indications that the pistol-toting Waverly blacks did organize to drive off slave catchers at least once, and that Waverly's white allies helped on another occasion by sending a group of slave hunters on a wild goose chase. Colored Hill got through that trying period without damage, and if anything, just kept growing. It soon hit its peak of about 60 folks, some of them free blacks who had joined them. They got their own church, an African Methodist Episcopal church, in 1856. Waverly opened its school doors and even its graveyard to black people, where segregation was usually the norm. During the 1850s, local white church leaders got off the fence and took open stands against slavery and its extension. By 1861, the South broke away from the Union and the Civil War broke out. The Abington area had a strong Loyalist population and men who volunteered to serve. But there was also stiff opposition in the region to Lincoln's war policies and treason laws, to the sweeping military drafts, and to the touchy idea of fighting for the black man. Further, when blacks were finally allowed to join the fight in 1863, there was racist opposition to that, too. Those issues are covered later in the segment titled, quote, War and Black Soldiery, end quote. 13 black men with ties to Waverly enlisted in 1863 and 1864 and were sent to war as part of the U.S. colored troops. In the face of scorn, they served with honor, and only 3 of them returned home unscathed. You will find their dramatic warriors discussed in segments 3 and 4 on this website. Afterwards, the veterans tried to settle back into normalcy in Waverly despite their various war disabilities. But the scorn stoked by the region's anti-Lincoln Democratic quote-unquote copperheads would not go away. In 1866, Pennsylvania Democrats put up a race-baiting candidate for governor and a campaign platform that read, quote, the white race alone is entitled to the control of the government of the Republic, and we are unwilling to grant to Negroes the right to vote, end quote. The Democrats churned out hate and misinformation, which caused one Waverly man, Dr. J.C. Miles, to fight back. The Democrats claimed black veterans were being paid their service bounties first and paid more than white vets. That is a barefaced lie, Dr. Miles declared in print, and he offered $100 to anyone who could prove otherwise. Dr. Miles had been attending to Waverly's injured black war veterans, and he wasn't going to let them be maligned. Others also supported the people of Colored Hill in the years after the war. The village, shown in this old photo, gradually turned Republican, and white residents were always willing to offer character references to the black vets and later to their widows as they applied for military pensions. The town's War Veterans Lodge accepted black vets as equal comrades and even helped to provide for their families as needed. The black children thrived in the schools. A few of the men started small businesses down in the village. In the 1890s, 3 men from Colored Hill were even elected to town office. The black church's outdoor summer revivals drew whites and blacks from across the region, another sign of Waverly's long-lived racial harmony. Gradually, the new generation moved away to seek their fortunes elsewhere, and Colored Hill aged in place. Folks moved down to Scranton, up to Binghamton, to Pittsburgh and beyond, usually for better jobs and opportunity. It wasn't always easy. One of them, George Brown, went on to found a black newspaper in Scranton in the early 1900s, and it was filled with bitter reports about discrimination in housing, employment, and accommodations. There's more on that in the segment titled One Family's Odyssey. Back in Waverly, the little black church, shown here, closed in 1923 as its last members died off. Colored Hill was no more, and a remarkable chapter in Waverly's past slipped into memory.